Did you have an early favorite author?
You know, some of the more classics like Robert Frost or Sarah Teasdale, Emily Dickinson. Those are the kinds of authors that I would read. But I think what really kind of informed me in high school and in college was philosophers and like people like, well, I like Thomas Hardy a lot, you know, because he was sort of grappling with spiritual issues, and I was also grappling with that in high school, sort of faith issues. And so I loved to read Thomas Hardy, and I loved Albert Camus, and I was really into, he was in the concentration camp, and he wrote that famous book. Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. That had a really profound effect on me. And so I started thinking about all these philosophical issues, and that, I think, then informed my poetry. Because for me, it was, in the early days, I think it was more about finding your identity as a young person, struggling with those issues. Who am I? Issues of belonging. Do I fit in? Those kinds of themes as a kid, or family, you know, family dynamics. So I think a lot of my exploration was, you know, sort of grew out of kind of feeling a little alienated maybe and a little lonely, and where's my place, you know, and being maybe super serious when everybody around me was sort of having fun. I was more of an introvert, you know, a lot of shy kids. So I drew my interests from more of the sort of philosophers and writers, you know, in that way.
Would you say your poems are philosophical? Or some?
I think some of them could be. I think the key thing, I tend to focus on more serious material. And I always used to joke in whatever writers group I was in, like, give me the challenge to write a funny poem, because it doesn't come natural to me. I think that I have a sense of humor and a sense of maybe like wittiness or cleverness, but I think there's always an underlying theme in my work of either there was a struggle and someone overcame that struggle, or I'm documenting like a family history. Like, I think you guys have heard some of my poems about growing up as an Italian American, and what does that mean. But behind them all, I think, is this sense of trying to find one's place in the world. And I think for me that's often what I'm doing in a poem, is exploring that theme of what's my place in the world, what's the narrator's place in their world. What questions am I trying to answer in a poem? What am I documenting? For me, whenever I write a poem, one is, it comes like out of an inspiration or an impulse to write something. Sometimes it's because of a writing prompt. But ultimately, I think it's about wanting to bear witness to an experience in the world. To find a way into that experience and share that ultimately. I think if I had to generalize about my poems, I think it's like poems of witness. There's a poet named Carolyn Forche who was very much into poems of witness, especially around Central America, South America. And not that I'm comparing myself to Carolyn Forche, but I like this idea of being a witness to what's happening in the world, whether it's my world or whether it's the broader world, and documenting that and showing that. So I guess they are somewhat philosophical in that regard.
Wanting to write humor, that reminds me, I'm sure it reminds you of another Lisa that says the same thing.
But wanting to be challenged
Lisa
to write.
Barron, yeah, she always says that her poems are too melancholy, and that's the thing. Do you think this is a female thing as opposed to I don't know, somehow or another, I don't usually hear male poets complaining about not writing enough humor.
Maybe there's a stereotype that maybe some of us are pushing against, and we don't want to be sort of lumped into a category. I can't speak for Lisa Barron, but I would imagine that that maybe that might be part of it. For me, I never really thought of it as a female thing. I just thought of it as me being like not overly sensitive, but sensitive to those things or things that I'm drawn to. I mean, the thing is, I love humor. I love, like, your poems have humor, yours do, and I appreciate that, and I love to laugh about it. But when I sit down to write my own poems, I don't necessarily tend to use that as a tool to bring. What I would say, though, is I think that some of the pieces I have written have a kind of satirical
They definitely do.
edge to them.
Mhm.
So there is satire. Maybe satire is too strong a word, but there is an edge of sort of social commentary with like a little bit of a raised eyebrow kind of thing. Like the one smiling with his mouth closed about, my uncle with wiring his teeth. I mean, I think that's funny.
It is. It does have its funny parts. Definitely.
Although some people might think it's kind of weird, it has a humor about life that you can laugh at. At least I can laugh at it. So I guess there is humor, but I don't tend to lead with that. If I discover it along the way when I'm crafting the poem and it fits, it's kind of a nice surprise to kind of put it in there, so.
Yeah, since you brought that poem up, and I was going to ask you to read it anyway, do you have it?
Yeah, I'd love to read it. Let me see.
That seems to be your signature piece, and
Yeah.
you seem to agree
Yes.
that it was. I just want to ask you, how do you feel about having a signature piece?
Yeah.
Are you glad that is considered your signature piece? Or are there other things that you feel, well, I've got other poems that are better that should be my signature piece?
Well, it's interesting you say that because for a long time, the poem that I read a lot was called Building a Nest. And the reason I read it a lot, it was a really good, for me, it was a good example of sort of how you build community and how you can stifle community. And so in those days when I was reading that a lot, I was doing a lot of facilitation and I group building, and it felt like a good poem to read. These days, though, because a lot of my poems tend to be serious, I start to read this one a lot because I think it puts people at ease and allows them to have a little bit of access into my poems that might be a little on the sadder side. And so in that way, I think by default, it has become my signature piece because it's like my comfortable poem. It makes other people feel comfortable. They think, they feel like, I feel like sometimes the audience begins to trust you as a poet to lead them to a place that incrementally that they can go to. So yeah, so I'm okay with it. But I kind of know what you mean, because like sometimes people, like I often do that with Bill Van Buskirk. I often will say to him, read that one poem, I love that poem. And I often wonder if am I like saying, are they just sort of sick of reading their poems, But anyway, this is called Smiling with His Mouth Closed. From the day he was big enough to lose teeth to the day he died, my great uncle posed for pictures with his mouth closed. He never had money to care for rotting teeth, so they each fell down, crumbling houses in decay. One by one, they caved in on themselves, cut off from their roots until all that was left was big sky and jagged earth. Finally, at 58, he won a small lottery and bought his first set of teeth, straight white caps, all in a row, saluting his lips, a development of dentures. He had hoped for a picture with his dear wife Stella, but lived only a week through new smiles. And in her last act of love, she had him laid out, his mouth wired open, his new neighborhood of teeth rising from the dead. I like that.
It is great. It's a very, it has a comforting factor in a moment of despair.
Yeah, and I think this was a prompt. This was a prompt in a writing group I was in back in the 90s. And we had opened up a book, and a sentence that popped out was smiling with his mouth closed. And so there were 10 of us in the group, and we each wrote to that, and this was what came out. And I didn't expect that I would land where I landed at the end of it, but when it came to me, it felt like the right thing to do. Because I felt like when we think about last wishes that people have, and if we can, we want to try to honor them in some way. And this has the sense of the macabre with it, mixed in to the reverence of it. You know, here's this woman who's doing something kind of weird to the world, but she's honoring, you know, this person's wish, that because she knew that this is what he would be so proud of, these teeth. You know?
So it's almost like Edgar Allan Poe telling a joke.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and of course, I think part of it also gets into this idea of, you know, I'm first generation in this country, the daughter of immigrants who are very poor. And so it hints at this idea of a marginalized community who didn't have money to care. So it paints a picture without actually talking about it. Do you know what I mean? And so I've been very proud of this poem for doing that, and I think it says it in a very poetic way. And and I think a lot of my poems do that. I try to have my poems honor my parents in some way, even if they're not mentioned necessarily. I'm very proud of my heritage, and I'm very proud of what they had to endure coming to this country and what they went through. And so in a way, I'm kind of like the archivist for the family, you know, the documentarian.
But you say it without making people feel like I'm coming out and saying this. You don't, you say it very subtly and very gently and
thanks. Yeah, I try not to like put it in someone's face, you know what I mean?
Right.
But it's, you know, those poems I think I don't read. If there are some, they're for me to kind of work out whatever I'm working out in a poem, you know. Poems have always started from a place of healing for me, as well as telling a story, but often I'm wrestling with something as a person, and writing is my therapeutic way to work that out. And if I get lucky, then the craft kicks in, and then maybe I can craft a poem that isn't just for me, but could be universal for other people that might move someone, you know? You never know who's in your audience, who might resonate with something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think about that, and I think about why that might be relevant for people.
For me, your poems are very earthy. Do you feel that they're
Tell me a little bit more
sensitive?
about what that means for you when you say earthy. I think I have a sense, but I'm curious about.
They're very grounded. They don't suggest anything too far out. You know, everything it's there. You can easily grasp it and hang on to it. Not every poet has that effect. You know, but
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you. I think in some ways my poems are more narrative and maybe a little bit more prose-like. They're more like prose poems than, say, you know, a form. I don't typically follow form. Like I don't write sonnets, I don't write, and I tend not to live in the abstract. Occasionally, some of my poems are a little bit more imagistic and a little hard to, you know, to come into it. But I try to tell a story. I think that is my forte, is to tell a story. And if I can find a great metaphor that will work and I can develop it, that's really good. But there are some poems that I've written that I think tend to be more philosophical or more abstract, where I want maybe someone to find their place in the poem. You know, and maybe, I don't want to say work a little harder, but have some space for them to enter into it and see if they can find something for themselves, you know.